Hey everybody. Today we are going to look at the second part of our series on the reliability of the Bible, looking in particular at the reliability of the Gospels. So last time we discussed the origins of the Gospels, and today we're going to turn our attention to what scholars call the Synoptic problem. So part two, the Synoptic problem. So one claim that people might make in order to suggest that the Gospels are not reliable, they might say, well, the Gospels contradict one another. And these contradictions suggest that therefore they are unreliable for telling us about the historical Jesus. To take just one example, Matthew and Luke differ on the order of Jesus' temptations in the wilderness. The three temptations are in different order. So what's that about? Another example, John puts the cleansing of the temple at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, whereas the other Gospels all have Jesus cleansing the temple the week before he's killed. And so on and so forth. Differences in wording, differences even in characterization of Jesus or other figures. Some people will say, well, these differences are just, they're too much, therefore they're contradictory, and so the Gospels are unreliable. And so the point I want to make in response to that is that in fact, these similarities and differences among Matthew, Mark, and Luke can be explained and accounted for by models of literary dependence. So we'll break that down. I want to point out that I'm holding off on the Gospel of John. We'll talk about the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John, next time. So today, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And indeed, these similarities among Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so great that they're collectively referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic meaning seen together. And so these three Gospels present very similar views of Jesus' teaching, ministry, and so forth. And in fact, they feature very similar wording. So not only is the content overall very similar, but down to the actual sentences and words, there are often identical features. Also, generally speaking, the events recorded in the Synoptic Gospels are portrayed in more or less the same order. There's a couple small differences, but by and large, they share a common order of events. And to give just one good example of this phenomenon, we can see that the three Synoptic Gospels even contain the same identical parenthetical material. So if you look, for instance, at Matthew 9:6, Jesus is healing paralytic. And Jesus says, starting in verse 5, "For which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Rise and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." And then a parenthetical aside, he then said to the paralytic, back to Jesus, "Rise, pick up your bed, and go home." So it interrupts Jesus' speech with this aside that Jesus then turns and says this to the paralytic. This exact same parenthetical interruption is found in Mark 2:10 and Luke 5:24. And so while oral tradition does keep the gist of things quite solid, we talked about eyewitness testimony and oral reliability last time, the exact parallels between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as evidenced by things like these identical parenthetical remarks, suggests to almost all people that the best explanation for understanding the similarities and differences among Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that there must be a literary relationship that exists among the synoptic gospels. In other words, one of these gospels must have served as a written source for one or both of the other synoptic gospels. That's the only way you can account for these similarities. That raises the question then of if one of the gospels must be the source for at least one of the other gospels, if not both, which gospel was written first? And according to most scholars, the most plausible explanation is that Mark wrote first, and that Matthew and Luke each made use of Mark's gospel in composing their own gospels. The early church, a lot of them thought Matthew was written first. Not everyone today agrees with this account that I'm presenting, but I do find it to be very persuasive. And so let me give you the reasons why. Number one, it seems like Mark must have been written first because Mark is the shortest of the synoptics. It excludes things like Jesus' birth narrative and his resurrection appearances. And so it makes much more sense that Matthew and Luke would add on those things to Mark's gospel that didn't have them than to see Mark deleting them from Matthew or Luke. Second, Mark has the poorest writing style and most primitive theology of the synoptics. So to give just one example in this category, Mark, his Greek is not good. It seems like every other sentence begins with kai, so and then this happened, and then that happened. It's just not written in super high level Greek. So again, it would make more sense that Matthew and Luke would clean up or polish Mark's writing, as opposed to Mark kind of messing with the more polished prose of Matthew or Luke. Third, Mark contains many difficult readings not found in Matthew and Luke. So again, to just give one example, Mark chapter 6, verse 5 and following. Jesus is in his hometown in Nazareth, and Mark says, and Jesus could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. He marveled because of their unbelief. So he could do no mighty work there. Any number of explanations for what that could mean, but one of them, it could suggest, one interpretation could be that somehow the lack of faith meant Jesus lacked the power to do these miracles. And I'm not sure we want to say that. And so Matthew clarifies what Mark must have meant. So if we look at Matthew, if we look at Matthew chapter 13, verse 58, the same story, it says, and Jesus did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. So Mark's account could have, in some people's minds, suggested that Jesus was dependent on other people for his power. But Matthew clarifies that no, it's that Jesus didn't do these things because he chose not to on account of their unbelief. So again, it makes more sense that Matthew and Luke would fix these perhaps confusing parts of Mark than the other way around. Fourth, Matthew and Luke rarely agree against Mark. So this would make it seem more evident that if Mark and Matthew sometimes agree against Luke, Mark and Luke sometimes agree against Matthew, but Matthew and Luke don't agree against Mark, we must have the diagram that I've put here. Finally, fifth, assuming Markan priority, that Mark was written first, gives a clear and consistent picture of the theological emphases of both Matthew and Luke. It helps make Matthew and Luke make a lot of sense. It's very clear. Whereas if you fiddle with this, it's really hard to understand what exactly the gospel writers were trying to accomplish. All right. So for these reasons, I and the vast majority of scholars today maintain that Mark was written first and that Matthew and Luke both used Mark as a source in composing their gospel. Now, most scholars also speculate that Matthew and Luke used an additional source besides Mark. And the German name for source is Quelle, source. So we call it Q. We don't have Q. If it existed, it no longer, it's not something we continue to have anymore. So it's a hypothetical source. But the reason a lot of scholars have speculated that they must have used an additional source, again calling it Q, is that there's a considerable amount of material that is found in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. So you have things that are in Matthew and Luke, and again, the similarities are very precise a lot of the time, but they're not in Mark. Primarily, these are sayings of Jesus. And as we've already suggested, it seems like Matthew and Luke don't know each other. They don't have the other one's gospel in front of them. And so the most plausible conclusion to draw then is that in addition to Mark, both Matthew and Luke drew on an additional source, Q, in composing their sources, in composing their gospels. And again, it's the precision, it's the exactness of the wording and the common ordering of this material that for most scholars suggests that this must have been a written and not an oral source. So again, there's no way to prove this. It's a hypothesis. A lot of people don't like this idea for a number of reasons. But to me, it seems like it makes the most amount of sense given the evidence that we have. And then to round this out, you'll note that Matthew and Luke each have things that are unique in their own gospels. In other words, Matthew and Luke, besides using Mark and Q, also made use of their own sources. And we know this is true from the Bible itself. After all, at the start of Luke's gospel, chapter 1, verse 1, Luke says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you." So Luke says he did his own investigating. He had his own sources. So Matthew's unique sources, call them M. Luke's unique sources, we call them L. So in total, we have 4 sources in the Synoptic Gospels. So we have the Gospel of Mark itself. So Mark is the first source. Second source, Q. This is the double tradition that is in both Luke and Matthew. Then third, we have the material unique to Luke. Fourth, we have the material unique to Matthew. So why does this matter? I think this matters because this solution to the synoptic problem allows us to more carefully study the Gospels and then analyze why there are differences among them. In other words, if we look at how Luke consistently adapts Mark in a certain way or with a certain pattern, that tells us about what Luke's unique theological interests may be. Likewise, if Matthew is changing Mark or Q, or he's utilizing it for his own purposes, maybe that tells us something about his particular audience or things that are of interest to him. And so this program of studying how Luke and Matthew are making use of Mark and their other sources is known as redaction criticism. And this is the basis for most study of the Gospels today. So if you hear someone in a podcast or a sermon talking about, well, in Luke's Gospel, this is one of the major themes, often they've come to that conclusion because scholars have studied this redaction. They've studied in light of what Luke is doing with his sources, according to this theory, this helps us unpack what Luke is interested in. So again, do you have to buy all of this? No, there's certainly many other ways you could explain and account for the similarity and the differences among the Synoptic Gospels. But again, for my money, this is what appears to make the most sense, and it is what most scholars continue to hold today. So for our Zoom discussion, to help us better investigate how this works and why Markan priority, I think, makes the most sense, and also how we can use this to learn more about the interests of Matthew and Luke, we're going to focus on the accounts of Jesus' temptations in each of the Synoptic Gospels. So that's Matthew 4, 1 to 11, Mark 1, 12 to 13, and Luke 4, 13 and following, because I left that off. So I want you to read through those three accounts. It should take you just a couple minutes. And then think about, how does our solution to the synoptic problem, as I've articulated it here, how does it help us explain the similarities and differences between these accounts? Because I'm going to say the differences are not contradictions. Rather, they reflect literary movements that the gospel writers have made in order to highlight certain emphases. So that'll be our subject for the Zoom discussion, and I hope to see you there.